Now, there was a horrible story, absolutely spine-chilling story about 10-month-old Jacob Crouch, who was killed by his stepfather. He had... Poor little Jacob had suffered at least 39 fractured ribs, with 22 of those occurring in the week of his death. He also had significant bruising, including to his cheeks, ear, and left thigh. He was eventually killed by, quote, brutal blow or blows to his abdomen, which in cause tore his bowel. Now, the forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Biggs, who gave evidence at the trial, said he'd normally expect to see such injuries in a car crash victims or someone who'd suffered a multi-story fall. His stepfather, Craig Crouch, has been sentenced to 28 years for battering that little baby to death. Now, as far as his mother is concerned, Gemma Barton, the judge accepted that she'd had mental health problems in the future, and that made her susceptible to being manipulated by this Craig Crouch. But she didn't do anything about it. So my question to you was, what's the right punishment, do you think, for parents in this situation? Could it maybe, in the situation of the mother, is that understanding that she needs, as well as punishment, or just straight out punishment? What about the father? What do you think should happen to parents in this situation? Because it's not a standalone case. It's not a standalone case. 0344 499 1000, 0344 499 1000. You can text the word talk to 87222, or tweet, or X as they now call it, at TalkTV, and tell us what you think. You might want to comment on anything else. I know we've got a caller we're going to be listening to a little bit later who takes issue, when I was talking with Joseph Cottrey-Monson about the image of, the legal profession. She's got something rather strong to say about that. So you might want to join in about that. You might also want to get involved when you hear our discussion about travellers. Do you think they get a bad rap in the press and from everybody telling them to move on? Do they cause trouble in society, or do you see the other side? Maybe you're a traveller. We're going to be speaking with someone who's very high profile in the traveller world about the stigma and the prejudice. You might think it's earned. You might think it's wrong. I'd love to hear from you either side. We've got to talk about these things. And this is the show where you can do that, because we hear from all people. But I want to come back to Jacob Crouch now. Now, if you've watched previous or listened to previous shows of mine, you would have been introduced to Dr. SoHomdas. He's a forensic psychiatrist. He, when you want to look inside the minds of those who kill, those who murder, he's a person to go to. He works with people who've done just that, who are part of the prison system. And he joins me now to talk about this awful killing of this murder, I guess you can call it, of this 10-month-old boy. Shoham, thank you so much for joining me again. My question to the audience, and if you don't mind starting off with you, when you read those details, when you read those sorts of things and you ask people, what do you think should happen to people who killed their children? Now, this is, to me, got different sides, because you've got a stepfather doing this, and you've got, it sounds like a heavily manipulated, I'll do anything to please him, mother standing by and doing nothing. So to me, it sounds like meting out punishments, it's not one size fits all. But most people would say, when you talk about child killing, throw away the key, or even worse, bring back the death penalty. Or, not that I agree with it. I'm just saying that's what people say. Let's talk about this case. Let's talk about the stepfather. Well, both of them together, and how something like this comes about.
Yeah, nice to see you again, Trisha. Yeah, absolutely. I think you used the word spine chilling when you were describing this case, and I completely agree with you. That's the perfect term. when I assess people that have committed horrific crimes, I try to look for some kind of mitigating circumstances or some kind of, redeeming factors. And I have assessed people who have injured their children where that has been the case. So, for example, if a mother has a severe mental illness to the degree that they are out of touch with reality, they're psychotic, they've got paranoid delusions.
Yeah, show postpartum depression. I mean, they've finally come up with a drug that can help mothers in the United States. It's a huge issue, postpartum depression. And to me, that's something, if anybody's guilty, it's in the systems for not picking it up. Postpartum depression is something that often sets in during pregnancy and gets missed and missed and missed again. So you're right. That to me feels different.
Yeah, and I have seen a couple of cases of postpartum depression where a mother, usually somebody who's quite isolated, maybe on her own, is really struggling with trying to get through those sleepless nights and the difficulties of having a newborn baby. But having said all of that, this feels completely different, doesn't it? I mean, Craig Crouch has basically attacked a completely defenceless 10-month-old. There weren't any extenuating circumstances that we know of. So it's hard to really call it anything apart from what it is. This is an evil, domineering man. I think the judge called him, reading from my notes here, domineering, aggressive, boastful, and arrogant. And if you've got somebody, with those kind of character traits that isn't struggling financially, doesn't have any mental illness, then this is basically domestic violence. There's no other term for it. There's no excuse.
And he was an absolute fantasist as well. I was just reading about some of the things that he told the mum. He told Gemma Barton. What was it? He told Barton multiple lies about himself. The police described him as a fantasist. He claimed to be a director at JCB. He claimed to be on a 6-figure salary. He was actually driving a forklift truck in a warehouse. He actually said that he met Boris Johnson and was flying around in some helicopter and what have you. So is that often something you see part and parcel of the control, the controlling what people employ to control others?
I think that's a bit of a red herring. So there are definitely some people who I've assessed who I think struggle with differentiating reality from fiction. You can call them fantasists. If you're talking about extreme mental illness, then we'd probably call that psychosis. But I don't think that's what's going on here. I think that basically what happened is that Craig told all these lies and he thought that his new partner, Gemma, was, unobtainable, out of his league. And that's why he lied. And you have to be careful what you wish for, because he ended up very quickly going into this relationship. She was pregnant with Jacob at the time. He was born a few months later. And then I think Craig found himself in the situation that although he initially wanted it, he couldn't cope. He didn't know how to be a father to this young baby. He struggled, like a lot of parents do, with the early days of trying to discipline, have peace, have rest with the baby crying. But unlike the vast majority of us who understand that that's our role as a parent, we have to find a way to deal with that. He couldn't handle it. So instead, he acted out violently, showing absolutely no disregard to Jacob's well-being, and probably accidentally eventually ended his life by killing him.
39 fractured ribs, with 22 occurring in the week of his death. 39. I mean, this is something that was sustained. Now, with his wife, or his partner, Gemma Barton, she was cleared of murder but found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child. Are there any mitigating situations for someone like her?
So something that you mentioned yourself earlier is that she has a known history of mental health issues, right? I think we have to be very, very clear that just because somebody has mental health issues, that doesn't affect their criminal culpability. No. It's a very kind of nebulous and complicated area, and you need exactly somebody like myself. So I work as an expert witness trying to figure that out. Obviously, I don't know the ins and outs of this case personally because I've not assessed Gemma, but I would say that the threshold to not be criminally responsible, to not be culpable, is extremely high. So another way of saying that is that the vast majority of people, even if they have, background depression, anxiety, whatever it is, they still know what they're doing and they're still responsible. Mm-hmm. And I'd argue that unless she had a very serious mental illness that we don't know about, which is highly unlikely, then I think Gemma is responsible. I think she, despite having mental health issues, she still was aware of what was going on and she needs to take responsibility. So I think it's only fair that that she gets a prison sentence, even if she had psychiatric issues.
So it almost sounds like, and it wouldn't be the first or the last time. I mean, this is a very extreme, awful situation where a woman has such low self-worth, they'll do anything, put up with anything to keep their man. In other words, their boundaries keep shifting to allow. Well, they become brainwashed. Their boundaries shift day by day, little by little, to accept more and more and more, and say, well, at least he didn't do this time, or at least he didn't do that. But meanwhile, in their own little bubble, things are getting increasingly worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things that strike me there. If you talk about the mother herself, I can throw out all these psychiatric adjectives if you want me to, but this is selfishness, isn't it? There's no other way of putting it. She's putting her own well-being and her own future romance ahead of the safety of her own child. And if we look at it from the perpetrators, from the father's perspective, often they are actually quite manipulative and quite charming. So I'm not just talking about physical abuse towards the baby, but even towards a partner. When we look at domestic violence relationships, a lot of people from the outside question, why do people, especially women, stay in these relationships? And the answer is, like you said yourself, they have quite low self-esteem, but also the perpetrator can actually be quite charming in between. So they have periods of losing their temper, of this violence that gets exchanged. And there's often what we call the honeymoon period. So they're very apologetic. They're overly nice. They do this love bombing afterwards. They promise their partner that they will change, and that was the last time. So it kind of almost gaslights and confuses the individual victim. So there's possibly an element of this going on, but regardless of all of that, and I'm sure you'd agree, the number one job of a mother is to look out for their well-being and the safety of their child.
Yeah, and you often think that if you can't do that, if you're in a situation that's dangerous, I think it's better to give the child up, to go to social services and say, my child is not safe. But again, there's that stigma of the mother being a bad mother. And if you're trying to paint from the outside, oh, I've got my man, especially if he's the big man in the local community, I've got my man, we're all happy together, that outside thing, you're also, invested in creating that whole illusion that things aren't going wrong when they clearly horrifically are.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely can, in some cases, be part of it. It could be about projecting an image, either because of your own narcissism or because you're too embarrassed to say that things are going wrong. You mentioned social services, Trisha, and there are resources available for families that are struggling, as well as social services. They can get financial help from the government. They can have parenting classes. There's, counselling.
I'm throwing Home Start because I'm a patron of Home Start, and that's one of the things that we really do. Not with with any situation. It can be multiple births, it can be illness. It's just with parenting, who people are struggling with kids under 5. Yeah, there are charities that do that if you want to engage with it. But then is it admitting in this and many other cases, is it admitting that this horrific stuff is going on at home? There's a load of shame around that, surely, and manipulation. I mean, having a kid who is a social worker, I know social workers get a lot of stick, but sometimes if they pitch up at a door to investigate something and there's some violent, evil brute there, then you've got to try to get police engaged to come with you and all that sort of thing. I mean, they threaten everybody.
Yeah, so everything that we've just been talking about, all these resources, everything from Home Start to social services, I think can work in some cases, but those are cases where you have individuals that are really struggling. They want to help. They want help and they want to change. They want what is best for their child. They just really don't have the tools to do that. I would argue that this feels completely different, doesn't it? I mean, you said yourself, 39 rib fractures. This is sustained. This wasn't somebody losing their temper and then regretting their actions immediately. This was somebody who was, you said yourself, violent, evil, brute. I wouldn't use those terms in my expert evidence, but that I completely agree with you. There's no other way to describe this kind of situation.
But you, again, in your work, would have to sit down with people like this. I'm not saying this exact case, like this. How do you deal with, to me, when I read and I hear this, and I probably only get a fraction of the details, it's a visceral reaction. How do you deal with it as just another day at work?
I suppose I'm very, very clear with what my role is. So if I met somebody like Craig Crouch, and I've not assessed him in person, but I've met people in very similar circumstances, I might have my internal opinions and views on him as an individual, and I'm sure they're very similar to what yours would be. But I know that my role isn't to judge him. There is a court system to do that. My role is to say, does he have a mental illness? Yes or no? If so, does his mental illness excuse some of his actions? And again, with the information that I know from this case, I would say that he might have some mild mental health issues in the background, but he's absolutely fully in control of his actions. So I suppose, to answer your question, even though I don't get to, judge him, decide if he's innocent or guilty, or have any part in his sentencing, by making that call, by differentiating him from the very small proportion of people who do have a mental illness and are not in control of their actions, then I'm kind of greasing the wheels of the justice, I'd like to think.
Final question. Do you, in your role, do you believe there's such a thing as an evil person? Are some people, I don't think that anybody's born evil, but from whatever happens to them, their life experiences, do you believe that for some people, they get to a stage where they are just evil?
I think there are people that are personality disordered. So they might have antisocial personality disorder, for example. They're impulsive, they're aggressive, they don't care about other people, they have a sadistic kind of streak, they might be hyper-masculine, might be very sort of machoistic. So I suppose those are the same things as being evil. So if you're asking me, do I think that nobody can be redeemed? I'd like to think that it's that most people potentially can be rehabilitated and can have a redemption arc, potentially. There's a different question about whether ethically everybody deserves that kind of attention, those kind of resources. I'm intentionally kind of avoiding that, but I think most people can. But there's a few issues. So first of all, the availability of resources, whether it's rehabilitation, and also their own motivation and insight. A lot of people, and I'm making some assumptions here, but I don't see somebody like Craig Crouch wanting to change necessarily. If it's so entrenched that you can have that level of vitriol and hostility towards an innocent 10-month-old baby, then I can't really see that there's much in terms of internal epiphanies or insights or wanting to change.
Oh, awful case. Shoham, thank you so much for your insight. Always a pleasure.